For players that are on the roster bubble, coming to the end of the preseason, it is a very stressful time because you're wondering whether you're going to make it or not. Well, for these Detroit Lions players, they are holding on by the skin of their teeth, and they definitely need to make a splash. We're going to talk about it, folks, so stay tuned.
What are we? What makes us what we are and what we're going to be? It's grit. It's what we started with last year, guys. Doesn't matter if you have one ass cheek and 3 toes. I will beat your ass.
Can definitely compete with the big dogs.
10, 5, end zone, touchdown, Detroit Lions.
You guys are unbelievable, man. I'm telling you.
We are driven by Detroit.
Hello, Detroit Lions fans, and welcome on back to yet another episode of MCM Motor City Mania. I'm your host, David T. Pike, and as always, we're diving on in. My friends, this is going to be an episode that I know for some is probably going to upset some people, and for others, this is going to be kind of a verification of what we already know for some players. However, though, before we dive on in, I wanted to give a quick shout out, and I wanted to show this really quickly. A fan of mine, his name is Ronnie Raymond, he decided to send this to me, and it came in the mail yesterday. This right here is a sign that he decided that he wanted to send to me free of charge. And obviously, if you can see it, it says grit, and it has the Lions emblem right here and everything. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Ronnie because this is an awesome gift, and I really do appreciate stuff like this. I appreciate, monetary donations. I appreciate gifts. So absolutely wanted to give a quick shout out to Ronnie because this is really awesome and totally was unexpected, and I'm totally thankful and appreciative for it. But just wanted to give that shout out really quickly before we got into the content. But having said that, now we're going to talk about the content. And let's understand something here, folks. For NFL players, especially those that are trying to make a roster, for those that are trying to, in essence, continue their dream, continue their livelihood of being an NFL player, the end of the preseason is one of the most stressful times imaginable because, again, you have to understand something here. The way that they have changed how the whole cutting situation works for the NFL is completely different now. It used to be back in the old days that you would do what would be known as gradual roster cuts, where it's like, every single week you would cut a certain number of players and you would get down from the 90 or so players that you had at the start of the preseason all the way down to the final, 53 men that you were going to go into the season. Now, so that way, these coaches can have the ability to get more time evaluating these players. Now, instead of doing gradual cuts, what the coaches in the front offices do is they just do one massive cut at the very end of all training camp and also preseason. And it's just like you go from 90 men overnight to 53 the next morning, and it's just like, dude, you lost half the damn roster. Now, granted, that's because half the roster is no longer going to stay with the team because they're not deemed good enough. And if they're lucky, they'll either get picked up somewhere else or they'll come back as that team's practice squad player. But the reason why this is so stressful for these types of players is because, once you get to the end of the preseason, now it's kind of like a numbers game. Now it's a wait-and-see game. You just don't know if you're going to make it or not because you got 90-plus players and you've only got 53 spots. That means that there's going to be about 40-some guys that are about to lose their jobs. So for me, I was like, here. Who are the guys that are currently on the roster bubble right now for the Detroit Lions that one way or the other, they could make it or could not make it, but their time's running out? Like, they're barely holding on to a job, and they have got to do something to make sure that, hey, when it comes time to say, do we keep this guy or do we have to let him go because somebody else is better and we need to keep that roster spot open, they're able to say, yep, this guy made the cut, we're going to keep him and cut somebody else. Who are the guys, in my opinion, that either really need to do something or there's other guys on this roster where it's like, listen, I don't see any way how they're going to stay on this roster because I just don't think they've done anything. I don't think they've done nearly enough that even if they were to have a splash performance in the final game of the year for the preseason for the Detroit Lions, that it would make a damn bit of difference because they just have not done much of anything. So that's who we're going to talk about in today's episode. And like I said, I already know for some, I'm definitely going to get a bunch of, negative comments. I already know that's coming. All I ask is, please, if you're going to say something negative or you're going to be, unhappy with my opinion, please, for the love of God, just be reasonable. Do not be nasty. Do not be mean. That's not called for here. I understand, spirited disagreement, but there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to start getting nasty about this. With that having been said, I've got a list of, I would say, about 7 or so names here, and I've kind of paired a couple of them together here to kind of, speed through this as much as I can. But here's the first group that I'm talking about, that are people that I think are on the roster bubble and their time's running out. And that's running backs Craig Reynolds and Jamar Jefferson. Now, I'm going to say this. I already know Craig Reynolds is going to be one of those guys that's going to get me a lot of negative comments for it. But let's understand the situation here. When it comes to Craig Reynolds, again, I'm going to make this abundantly clear. I like what Craig Reynolds provides as a player, what he provides as a teammate. He is definitely the embodiment of a Dan Campbell type of player. He does his job. He does it very well. He puts his nose to the grindstone. He doesn't complain. That's exactly what you want out of a player. But the problem is that there's only 53 roster spots, and of those 53, only 46 dress every single Sunday. That means that every single roster spot is absolutely critical. You have to make sure that you have the best 46 potential dressing every single Sunday. And the problem is that for Craig Reynolds, in times past, he would have absolutely made it. 100%. 2023, made it. 2022, made it. 2021, made it. But the problem is that there was no real viable other option at running back number 3. The reason why, now that that's a problem for him, is because of Sione Vaki. I'm saying this right now because it's the truth. Sione Vaki has outplayed freaking Craig Reynolds. He's outplayed him as a running back, and he's outplayed him as a receiver. There's no two ways about it. That's the nature of the situation. And it's not even only Craig Reynolds, it's also Jamar Jefferson. Because let's call it for what it is. We've both heard reports that Craig Reynolds and Jamar Jefferson have had strong camps. That's why I'm pairing the two together. But the problem is that when they've gotten out on the field, they've not been doing really anything. It's all pretty much been Sione Vaki that's been primarily getting all the news at running back. And, let's call it for what it is. When Sione Vaki gets out on the field, he's making plays. He's making great catches and picking up yards after the catch, or he's making good runs. Whereas guys like Reynolds and Jefferson, yeah, they get out there, but what are they really doing? They're not really doing anything. And that's the problem in preseason, is that you have to find ways to stand out, especially when you have another guy like Vaki who's coming in there and he is just killing it. That's why in a competition like this, for guys like Reynolds and Jefferson, their inability to stand out on the game field to actually produce on game day, that's what's really making it very difficult for them to try and get into this conversation. Because let's call it for what it is here. Most teams are going to likely carry 3 backs. They might carry 4 just in case of injury. But then that means you're going to have to cut somewhere else. Do you carry less cornerbacks? Do you carry less wide receivers? That's where the numbers game starts coming to effect. That's why for guys like Reynolds and Jefferson, who have not really done a whole lot up to this point on game day, even though they've had strong camps, they have to do something in the final preseason game to make it to be like, okay, if we cut this player, we're probably going to lose out on more than we could possibly gain from somebody else taking their spot. That's why I'm saying it's going to be absolutely critical for one of these two to step up in the final preseason game that's coming up on Saturday and say, hey, this is what I can do. Because in the first 2 preseason games, they've not really done much, and that's not a good place to be going into in the final week here. So, Craig Reynolds, Jamar Jefferson, 2 guys that I think are absolutely on the roster bubble, and they've got to do something fast. Player number 2. Now, this is one of those guys where I don't think anything's going to relatively save him, and there's a couple of reasons why. And the player that I'm talking about is Stephon Gilmore. Stephon Gilmore's, I believe it's his younger brother. And I'm just going to say this right now. I love Stephon Gilmore. I have loved what this kid's potential has been ever since I saw him in preseason last year. Because last year, he was the best cornerback that we had in the preseason. Because if I recall correctly, I think he had, 2 or 3 interceptions in the preseason last year? He absolutely looked like, hey, all this guy really needs is more time to develop, and he could be pretty damn good. And the fact that I have to put him on this list, I hate doing that. I detest it because I really like Gilmore. But the problem is that, unfortunately, he is in the one position group right now where he's not got a very good shot of making it. Because the Lions this offseason, they completely revamped the secondary. And that means that they brought in a lot of new faces. They brought in 4 new cornerbacks this offseason. They drafted Terrion Arnold. They drafted Rakestraw. They traded for Carlton Davis. And they signed Amik Robertson. All 4 of those guys are making the roster. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So it's like, okay, you've already got 4 cornerbacks that are definitely making the roster. But then after that, you've still got Vildor and you've still got Dorsey. And the reason why I don't think those guys are going anywhere is because with all those other guys that we're talking about here, other than Robertson that were sitting out with injury, Vildor and Dorsey were the guys that primarily got the starts against, the Chiefs on Saturday last week. Which right there, that tells me that, okay, if we're talking about the hierarchy or the pecking order of the cornerback room, Arnold, Davis, Rakestraw, Robertson, then it's Vildor and Dorsey, Gilmore kind of falls at the very end of it. And again, most teams are not going to carry 7 cornerbacks. They might carry 6 or 5. Because again, it's a numbers game. Because every position, every player that you keep extra at a position means you have to take away from somewhere else. That's where this starts becoming a really painful process. Because it's like, man, I really like this guy, but I can't keep him without having to cut somebody else. Now, I will say this. While I think that Gilmore's not going to make the active roster, I'm almost certain that once he gets cut and everything happens where, every player clears waivers and, everybody has a chance to go after whoever the Thunder they want to, the Lions are most certainly going to bring him back as a practice squad player because, 1, he has familiarity with the squad, he has familiarity with the defense, but on top of that, we already know that he's a good player. We already know that he has strong potential. So again, even though while Gilmore is probably not going to make the active roster, it would not at all surprise me if he comes back as a freaking practice squad player, which I think would be the best thing for him at this point. More time to get better and better. So that's player number 2. Player number 3. Oh boy. I already know that this is going to be the one that is absolutely going to get me the most flack. And I know that there are people who are absolutely going to disagree with me. 100%. But unfortunately, that does not change the fact or change the position of James Houston's precarious spot on this roster. Yes, I'm putting James Houston as a roster bubble candidate. And the reason why is because let's take a look at the situation here, folks. James Houston has done very, very freaking little since the end of 2022. Now, I understand. A good portion of that is because of the fact he's been dealing with injury. And let's call it for what it is. You can't do anything while you're injured. But that simply is not an excuse to save his roster spot. You think I'm lying? Take a look at what the Lions did with Antoine Green. They cut him and gave him an injury settlement. That's the nature of the business. The Lions are not going to hold on to players simply because, we're sorry you got injured. We don't want to see you cut. That's not going to save your job. The Lions are looking for the best players to fill this roster. And when you're vying for a Super Bowl, again, every roster spot is a critical measurement that has to be weighed and balanced to figure out who's the best candidate for every single spot available. And that's the problem with James Houston. Again, I'm not going to deny this. James Houston is a really, really great situational pass rusher. But that's the problem. He is a one-trick damn pony. Hell, when Aaron Glenn is saying he's a one-trick pony, when Dan Campbell's saying he's a one-trick pony, that right there is a major red flag. Because it's like, listen, if you're going to be a one-trick pony, being good is not going to cut it. You've got to be one of the best at what you do. And I'm sorry to say it, James Houston is not one of the best edge rushers at what he does. He's just simply a good one, and it's only in certain situations. I'm sorry, James Houston is not a freaking Bruce Smith. He is not a Michael Strahan. He is just good at what he does. He is not an all-time great. If he was one of those, then this wouldn't even be a conversation piece. But that's not the way it is. And when you're talking about James Houston, you have to understand that because of him being a one-trick pony, that's going to make it much more difficult for him to get on the roster. Because again, the Lions have already tried 2 separate times to expand James Houston's role so that way they could say, hey, we want you to make it more difficult for us to not have to cut you. But both times they've tried to expand his role, they've had to cut it back because he simply cannot get it. They tried to get him to be more of a Sam linebacker, 2 separate occasions, and both times they're like, no, he's just not ready. He can't play the position. He's not good at being able to drop back in coverage. He doesn't understand the responsibilities of the position. So we have to cut that out, and we have to go back to what he's really good at. And that's the problem. For a guy that has had 2 separate occasions, both at the beginning of 2023 and this year, to try and expand his role, and both times the coaches are like, you're just not getting it. We can't go anywhere with you on this. That right there is not a good sign. And then furthermore, when you're pairing that with the fact that over the last 2 years, he's had to deal with 2 separate lower leg injuries, the ankle in 2023 and now the shin bruise this year, he's starting to develop an injury trait and missing time in the preseason, especially when you're in the position that you are right now. You're vying for a job. That's not good because anytime you're missing out on reps, you are allowing somebody else to step in and potentially get reps to show off, aka in this case, it's Akuwu. That right there is a guy that I honestly believe, because he's been able to show a lot more being at the linebacking position and also doing edge rushing stuff like what Houston is known for, he's got a very good shot to supplant James Houston because he's got a much wider, pretty much playing style. He has the ability to do more than what James Houston does. And again, that goes back to the problem of being a one-trick pony, because if you're going to be on a roster as talented as the Detroit Lions, you have to have the ability to wear multiple hats. You can't just be a one-trick pony unless you're a kicker or quarterback. And since James Houston is neither of those, that's not going to save his job. Them be the facts. That's why this is such a hard position for James Houston. And there's a lot of indicators based upon what the coaches have said, based upon their actions, based upon what Houston has not been doing and what he has been doing, which has been very little. Every indicator points that Houston is probably going to be one of those cuts that is going to be on the more painful side because there's clearly talent there. But when you're only doing one thing really well and it's only in certain situations, most rosters are not going to include a one-trick pony that's only good in certain situations. They have to maintain the roster over the entirety of it to make sure they have the best 46 players rather than just one guy that's good at one singular thing, especially if it's not a quarterback or a kicker. Or a punter. Pardon me, I forgot about punters there too for a minute, but I digress. Player number 4, tight end James Mitchell. Again, Mitchell is simply one of those guys that has not lived up to the potential that he had when we drafted him. Now, I understand, James Mitchell was not a high draft pick when we drafted him. I think he was a 6th round draft pick. But this was a guy that was coming out of Virginia Tech where it was like, hey, this guy's played quarterback. This guy has played a multitude of different positions over his time in college and in high school. This is a guy that has a different amount of varying skill sets to where we could potentially plug him in at multiple areas. So I thought that multi-positional versatility was something that he could use to his advantage to find different ways to stay on the roster. However, though, Mitchell has simply not been able to do anything to stand out. And let's call it for what it is. It's not like he's got some really great competition in the tight end room. Yeah, we know. Sam Laporta, that's not even up for debate. Brock Wright, also not up for debate. Those guys are tight end number 1, tight end number 2. But he could beat out Shane Zylstra, but he hasn't. That's the problem. Shane Zylstra was injured all last year. James Mitchell was tight end number 3 by damn default last year. He should have had plenty of opportunity to grow and progress as a tight end. But correct me if I'm wrong here. How many reports have we heard about James Mitchell absolutely lighting it up in practice, standing out, showing growth and progression? As far as I'm concerned, I've only heard goose eggs. There's been nothing that's been saying that James Mitchell has been doing anything in practice. There's been nothing that's been showing really out on the field. He's made a catch here or there. Again, that's not good because we already know Shane Zylstra can play the position because he's done it in the past. So for the fact that, James Mitchell has not shown any growth or any progression this training camp and preseason, that right there is bad. Now, I will say this. I thought potentially that with Jason Kabinda not coming back, that maybe James Mitchell might find an avenue to possibly play some fullback, because tight ends and fullbacks kind of interchange quite a bit now in the NFL. But again, haven't really heard too much on that front. And we already know that last year the Lions used Malcolm Rodriguez in that role as a fullback. So to me it's like, hey, the Lions have options there. They're willing to plug players into that position if they feel the need. But again, I really haven't heard a whole lot on James Mitchell being at the fullback position. So for me, it's like Mitchell at this point is merely just holding a roster spot. He's just a body that's just in camp and he's not really doing anything with it. That's not a good position to be in because, again, one thing we've now learned is that the Lions are not afraid to cut players that are Brad Holmes draft picks if they're not living up to their potential, and there's other guys that have come in that are doing better than them. And that's, again, nature of the business. So that was player number 4. Player number 5, or rather I should say group number 5. It's got to be wide receivers Darice Fountain and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Again, this kind of goes back to the very same concept I had with Craig Reynolds and Jamar Jefferson. Again, Donovan Peoples-Jones and Darice Fountain, this is going to come down to which guy I think shows more in the final preseason game, number 1. But it's also, again, going to come down to the numbers game on who's going to take up those valuable roster positions. Because, again, if the Lions decide to keep an extra cornerback, an extra running back, that's going to almost certainly mean that there's going to be less positions available at the wide receiver position. Pardon me. Now, when it comes to Fountain and it comes to Donovan Peoples-Jones, Fountain has been much more consistent in practice. There were several times where we heard that he was absolutely killing it in practice. He was tearing it up. He was making plays. He was helping the offense move on the ground. The problem is that when we get to the games, he's not doing anything. So it's like, great, the guy's a practice warrior. The guy can absolutely tear it up in practice. But what the hell are you doing when it comes time to play the game? You're not really doing much of anything. So that ability to translate what's happening on the practice field to the game field is simply being disappeared. It's not showing up. And when you've got a guy like Isaiah Williams, who's an undrafted free agent, who is completely overshadowing Darice Fountain, that's a massive problem right there. And that exact same problem is also carrying on to freaking Donovan Peoples-Jones, but actually it's even worse for him. And that's because Donovan Peoples-Jones has the most experience out of all the wide receivers. He's also got freaking the most knowledge of the offense of these guys that I'm talking about right here. You know, freaking Williams, Fountain, and all the rest of them. But the fact of the matter is that Donovan Peoples-Jones has gotten no production really this preseason. And when you've heard literally Dan Campbell say that he has to step up, we are expecting more out of him, that already puts a bullseye on his back. That's not a good position to be in. So, again, the fact that both Fountain and Donovan Peoples-Jones are in this position, it's very troubling. And it's part of the reason why I'm still strongly advocating that the Lions should just simply cut their losses and go into the free agency period and get freaking Hunter Renfrow. Again, I know some people have suggested Julio Jones, but it's like, listen, Julio Jones is 35 years old. He's lost a lot of his speed. He's lost a lot of his ability to play the wide receiver. I don't want just a guy that's big that you can just throw the ball up to. I want a guy that can actually do something with the ball after the catch and also can stay on the field. Julio Jones can't do either of those things very well anymore. That's why I advocate Hunter Renfrow. Yes, he's not a big guy, but he definitely knows how to make plays, and he's one of the most sure-handed catchers in the NFL. That's why I've said what I've said about Hunter Renfrow, and I'll put the link to the episode what I'm referring to back up at the top, so that way if you guys want to, you can go back and watch all that evidence. But those guys that I just mentioned, all like 7 of them, are guys that I think are on the roster bubble, or guys that I think, listen, it don't matter what the hell they do, they're probably getting cut. But you guys let me know what you guys think. And again, all I ask is please be respectful. We can be respectful yet still disagree, folks. That's something I'm going to strongly advocate here. But having said that, I'm going to end the episode and say thank you all for watching yet another episode of MCM Motor City Mania. If you like what you saw, by all means, I highly encourage y'all to watch the next episode. Also encourage y'all please to do one of these 3 things: like, comment, and subscribe. If by chance you subscribed in the past and you forgot to do so at the time, or you just subscribed and not had a chance to do so, again, want to highly encourage y'all to subscribe, but I also want to encourage y'all, please, make sure y'all hit that bell notification icon so that way you guys never miss any more content that I push out. Also want to encourage y'all to share this content with your Lions friends and family members. Share it here on YouTube, share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook, share it anywhere and everywhere you can with everybody and anybody that you can. The more we can share it, the greater the channel grows and spreads, and the greater reach we have to bring in new people to watch the content. And with that being said, I hope y'all enjoyed watching the content. I hope y'all are doing well. Hope y'all got something in your life that makes you happy, makes you smile. God bless. And until the next time we meet, I'll see you all in the next episode.